Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, and today I am bringing you all my ban list prediction. So we're calling this an August 2023 prediction list since it's currently August, but I could also see Konami not releasing their list until sometime in early September to get a few more regionals and such with Duelist Nexus cards legal just to see what happens. Anyways, I feel like a lot of changes on this list are going to be the common things that everyone is saying, so we're going to try not to dwell on those too much, but of course it's always interesting to see how many things we can predict based on what we've seen Konami do in the past, so let's get started. Alright, so to start things off with the Forbidden section, I have Kashtira Arise Heart as the first card being banned. I feel like regardless of whose prediction you're paying attention to, Arise Heart is getting banned, and it's pretty obvious why. This card is just such a big obstacle in the game for so many decks, and Kashtira continues to be one of the most dominant decks in the game, despite a couple of hits on the last list. One of my friends recently visited Locals, and he hasn't played Yu-Gi-Oh! Since Zodiac format, and we were talking about like what the best decks currently are, and when I tried to explain to him exactly what Arise Heart is, I had to tell him that it's a Trident that banishes face down instead of destroying, has a built-in Macro Cosmos effect, and can basically attach infinite materials per turn to itself from your banished pile. I think that there are some decks that just don't naturally have an out to this card, right? Or even if they do play an Imperm or a Kaiju, they can't play the game entirely if this card is on the field and they don't draw an out, so this card just becomes too big of an obstacle that keeps decks out of the game. Given how Kashtira has arguably been the best deck over the last two entire formats, I think that everyone is correct in assuming that we will finally see Arise Heart banned. On to the next one, we have Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity. So this is actually a relatively old card, but it wasn't really a problem card until recently with the release of Crimson Dragon in Duelist Nexus. Basically, when this card is summoned, it's a turn skip where your opponent can't activate cards or effects during the turn this card is summoned, and they can't respond to this effect either. Now with Crimson Dragon, it's a little bit too easy to bring this card out and force your opponent to skip their turn, which is likely leading to them being OTK'd the turn after, and honestly it just doesn't sound very fun to play against at all. We have precedents set for complete turn skips getting banned out of the game, with cards like Azathoth and Shockmaster that basically prevent your opponent from doing anything at all, so I hope that we see King Calamity banned for the same reason. They obviously won't ban Crimson Dragon itself, seeing as it's a brand new card, so I think the rational thing to do would be to ban King Calamity out of the game before it becomes too degenerate. Alright, moving on, we have Eradicator Epidemic Virus. So I did think that this one would be kind of a consensus pick to be banned. I think that by now everyone has seen the memes of Eradicator destroying 4 or 5 cards out of your opponent's hand because you're flipping it during your opponent's standby phase when you're going first, and basically you just win the game right there. And it's not like there was one isolated incidence of this happening. This has happened at least 3 or 4 times that I can think of in the top cuts of big events, and I'm sure it has happened to a lot of players at the local and regional level as well. Like honestly, I guess it is kind of funny to look back at, but it's definitely not fun to play against, especially when you can't do anything really to prevent it. I think that the thing that pushed this over the top was Labyrinth being able to set it to your side of the field with Lady, and then activating it in the same turn with Coup Clock, but even decks like Kashtira, Dragon Link, and Vanquish Soul are citing Eradicator because if they happen to draw it and they are able to resolve it in the right matchup, that's a free win for them. Honestly, I think that putting this card to anything other than 0 would be a mistake. We saw what happened when they experimented with Imperial Order coming off the list, and this is functionally the same thing. With all of the negative attention that we've seen whenever Eradicator has a chance to resolve, I'm almost certain that this card is going to be banned on the upcoming list. One final card that I have banned, another one that I personally think is really obvious, it's Dimension Shifter. So D-Shifter has always been a polarizing card. I think everyone always hated seeing this card when Fluwanderees used it, especially if you were on Tearlament, but D-Shifter just feels like yet another card that is too big of a blowout when it resolves for it to reasonably stay in the game. Now I do understand that there are a lot of reasons for this card to not be banned completely. It's not completely unreasonable. I think a lot of people argue that this card should be semi-limited or limited so that your trade-offs are different, right? With D-Shifter, it has always been about those trade-offs, and whether the benefit of possibly seeing this card in your opening hand outweighed the negatives of you seeing this card later in the game or maybe bricking on it in a top deck situation. And while the answer hasn't always been clear, especially when the card first came out, I think it's really obvious that most decks that are able to run this card find it worth it to make that trade-off now, given how fast decks can operate. If you see D-Shifter in your opening hand, most of the time your opponent's turn is skipped. It's incredibly frustrating to play against. I remember watching a Dragon Link player basically getting 2-0'd because his opponent, who was on Kashtira, resolved D-Shifter in both games and forced his opponent to skip their turn, and then killed him instantly, right? The whole round was done in maybe like 10 minutes. But yeah, another degenerate card that admittedly hasn't always been so frustrating, but I think that given what we've seen from this card under Fluwandereeze and Kashtira, it's finally time for the card to be banned. So next up, we're on to the limited section, and my first limit here is Kashtira Fenrir. So with Fenrir, I see this one hit as a way to both hit Kashtira and to stop a really strong standalone monster from being splashed into basically every single deck. Now when it comes to Kashtira, I think that a Rise Heart being banned should be a big enough hit, but hitting Fenrir just further gets across the point that Kashtira shouldn't really be a top tier deck anymore, right? Between Raitsoth, Fenrir, and Unicorn, the deck has access to so much searching for its various pieces. I think that it's pretty reasonable for Fenrir to be limited. This is actually the only other Kashtira hit I have on the list. I think Unicorn can stay at 2. When going over things, I considered also putting Unicorn or Birth to 1 as well, and those things might still happen if they really want to hammer Kashtira, but I think that getting rid of a Rise Heart should really be enough, and should stop the deck from doing anything too over the top anymore. At the same time, I don't think Konami wants Fenrir to be in the game as a staple monster that's being run in absolutely everything. It's too strong of a card on its own. It literally can make the game so difficult for your opponent to play because its banish effect is so strong, and the fact that it replaces itself for follow-up on your next turn while being so big and easy to summon is just kind of silly. The OCG had this card limited and then banned. I think the card is still fine at 1. It can be used by Kashtira to search for other monsters from the deck, but I think that now it won't be abused by everything else. Maybe only Vanquished Soul will be able to play it if they want to use Rise Heart as a fire target. But yeah, Fenrir didn't really live up to all of its hype here in the TCG. It never really had its time to shine the way that it did in the OCG, but in order to prevent it from being just a staple 3-of in everything moving forward, I think that we should expect to see Kashtira Fenrir limited on the next ban list. The next limited card we have here is Bystial Magnemite, so I think that Dragon Link is something that Konami is absolutely going to address on the ban list. Dragon Link has existed for I think almost 4 years now, ever since the Rocket structure deck first came out, and while it has gone through a lot of variations and changes, the core idea has generally been the same. We've seen hits to things like Elpie and Agripane, but really I think that Dragon Link needs a couple more hits to bring them back down to the level of other decks in the current format. This is especially true if we see hits to Kashtira, a Rise Heart, and D-Shifter, two really problematic cards for Dragon Link that made it difficult for them to play, even though the deck was already pretty strong. For my first Dragon Link hit, I have Magnemite going to 1, which I think shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone. The Bystials were really popular in tier limit format, since this card is functionally a hand trap with a pretty big body. But the insane thing is that this card searches for literally any dragon monster in the game on the turn it's summoned. It doesn't have to be summoned by its own effect, and there is no restriction for the dragon monster that you search. Dragons are obviously one of the more supported types in the game, and there's so many crazy good cards that you can search depending on how the game state looks. Things like Starleech Safer, Chaos Dragon Levianeer, and the Bystial Lubellion are all really amazing search targets that could provide solid follow-up during your next turn, so being able to open with this card so easily is kind of crazy. Even if this card is at 1, it'll still be really strong. You can search it with Bystial Lubellion, summon it with Hieratic Spheres, or revive it with Branded Regained, so this hit alone is not going to kill Dragon Link off completely, but I definitely think that Magnemite is just a ridiculously powerful card that should absolutely be limited on the list. So, Chaos Space is the other card that I have limited here as another way to hit Dragon Link. I actually think a lot of people might call me crazy for this hit, but I think that limiting Chaos Space is actually a really good way to hit the consistency and power of the Dragon Link strategy. First of all, the targets that you can search with Chaos Space are pretty crazy, with either the Bystial Lubellion, Chaos Dragon Levianeer, Wyverbuster, or Collapse Serpent. With each of these cards, you are getting access to a big part of your engine. Either you're setting up Branded Beast and opening up the Bystial side, or you're using the black and white dragons to get to Romulus into Ravine, or you're using Chaos Dragon Levianeer to rip a card from your opponent's hand or blow up their entire board. Yes, you do have to discard a card to use Chaos Space, but there's so many good cards that you can search off of Chaos Space, I don't think that the discard cost really matters that much, especially when you're playing so many hand traps. On top of that, the graveyard effect of Chaos Space is actually kind of crazy. You can put back the baby black and white dragons to cycle them again, or you can put back a link monster like Striker Dragon, who was obviously limited for a reason. Between Chaos Space and Branded Regained, it feels like the deck can just put back 2 extra deck monsters and draw 2 cards for no reason, making it really difficult to trade with the deck, and I think it's a big part of why it feels like regardless of how many interruptions you have against Dragon Link, they always have more ways to extend their plays and can play through all of your interactions and OTK you anyways. So yeah, maybe a bit of a hot take here, but I think that Chaos Space is actually another card out of Dragon Link that I would expect to see hit in order to bring down the deck that has been pretty consistently strong over the last several years. Moving on from Dragon Link, I have Runic Tip being limited to 1, so when it comes to Runic, I actually find the deck kind of interesting. Yes, it can be very frustrating to play against, but really a lot of the Runic cards just feel like hand traps. On top of that, if your copy of Runic Fountain is gone, you are literally stuck there, so while it's great if you can sit on Fountain and just mess with your opponent, there is a chance that they can shut you off pretty easily as well. So I do think we will see Runic hit on this upcoming list. I think that Runic Sprite for Hire being a top 3 deck of last format definitely means that the deck will be hit in some way. It seems that the popular choice is to limit Runic Fountain, but I feel like that would just completely kill the entire engine. A single Cosmic Cyclone means that the entire engine basically can't function at all anymore, and I don't think we're at the point where the engine just shouldn't exist completely, especially since we do have the Runic reprints coming in the 2023 Megatins. I think that limiting Tip makes much more sense. The engine isn't nearly as strong because you can't just hold onto your Tip and search for the interruption based on what the situation is. There's a bit more variance to it because you're just accessing Fountain and then using whatever runic spells you happen to have in your hand at the time. Also, having Tip can be kind of crazy, right? Because you are using Tip to search for another interruption, and then that's 2 spells that you put to the bottom of your deck to draw 2 cards. So with Tip at 1, that is much less likely to happen, and you're less likely to be able to shuffle back 2 or 3 cards and draw 2 or 3 cards as a result. So yeah, I think that limiting Fountain would have made sense if you wanted to completely kill off Runic, but I think that limiting Tip and leaving Fountain at 2 is a much more reasonable hit, such that the engine will still be somewhat viable this format. Next, I do have Pearly Sleepy Memory going to 1, a hit that was made over in the OCG, rather than hitting Delicious Memory like we did here in the TCG. So last format we saw Pearly actually still perform fairly well, despite Delicious Memory being limited to 1, I think a little bit earlier than everyone was expecting. Although the deck wasn't the best deck of the format by any means, it was still a really strong contender. However, with Kashtira, Dragon Link, and Runic Sprite all presumably taking hits on this list, I think it makes sense that Pearly takes another hit as well, in order to stop it from taking over the format as the only deck that goes untouched. I feel like Sleepy Memory should be the obvious hit, as it is what allows you to draw multiple cards during your opponent's standby phase, and the card being limited to 1 is going to restrict what Pearly players can do. The other thing is, I think it's important to note that Sleepy Memory came out as a common, and generally we've been seeing cards printed in lower rarities being more susceptible to being hit on the ban list. That's what happened most recently with Super Heavy Samurais, where Scarecrow was banned so shortly after Cyberstorm Access, where Wakaushi, Big Benkai, and the Bike were all printed in relatively low rarities. So yeah, while Pearly wasn't exactly dominant last format, I think there's a good chance that we see Sleepy Memory hit as a preemptive way to ensure that Pearly doesn't become too strong with all of the other decks around it getting weaker. One last card in the limited section, it is Sprite Starter. So I think we're going to see Starter limited to 1 on this list finally, and that's going to match at least one of the ways that Sprite has been hit in the OCG. I feel like Sprite isn't a ridiculously crazy or strong deck, but rather it's just a deck that always seems to perform fairly consistently. The fact that you can combine it with any deck that runs level 2 monsters is kind of silly, as we've seen it mesh with random other things like Gishki and For Hire. I think that a hit to Sprite is necessary still to stop the deck from continuing to just exist in every single format. I feel like it always finds a way to combine itself with something else and manage to stick around. To me, it doesn't really make much sense to hit anything else. I don't think that Jet or Blue or Carrot or Red are really that broken in and of themselves to justify being hit. There might come a day where another really broken level 2 base deck comes out, and Konami might need to hit the engine further in order to just stop this from being the de facto engine that everyone has to use all the time. But until then, I think that Sprite is a pretty reasonable strategy to deal with. I feel like without Elf, and with just one starter, the cards are only as strong as the other engines that you can combine them with, so as long as everything else is being reasonably hit, limiting starter to 1 should be a big enough hit to the engine to curb down the power just enough. Alright, I just have one card that is newly going from unlimited to semi-limited. The other 2 cards are actually coming off the list, so this one is going to be Pot of Prosperity. Now on the surface, I do think that Pot of Prosperity is actually a reasonably balanced card. It's just a 1-for-1, so it doesn't generate you an absurd amount of advantage, it limits the damage that you can deal, it prevents you from drawing for the rest of the turn, and it forces you to banish cards from your extra deck that would be resources you could go into. However, I think that the problem with Prosperity is that it pushes the power of certain decks a little bit too far, particularly decks that are hyper-consistent, or decks that run multiple engines. Now for a hyper-consistent deck, we can consider Kashtira, which really only needed to see Kashtira Unicorn in order to make a full board. Pot of Prosperity either got you the card you needed if you for whatever reason didn't have access to Unicorn, or more realistically, it was being used at the end of your combo to search for a protection or disruption, something like a Forbidden Lands, Book of Moon, Infinite Impermanence, or Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. At the same time, when we consider multiple engines that are being meshed together, those engines are usually more compact and only require you to see one piece of the engine in order to utilize it. A natural trade-off is that you might not naturally see a particular engine, but Prosperity allowing you to dig through almost 20% of your remaining deck, or more depending on what you've already gone through, is actually kind of crazy. The OCG has Prosperity limited for a reason, and while I don't think we're quite there yet, I think Prosperity is an overly powerful card that should probably be addressed. This card being hit might wait until we see the card being reprinted in a more accessible version, but for now it wouldn't surprise me to see Prosperity semi-limited to 2. The rest of the cards here we're probably just going to breeze through. I think usually with cards that are being pulled off the list, there's not really that much to discuss. For cards going from 1 to 2, I have Miscellaneousaurus and Spellbook of Judgment. Some people say that Miss going to 2 is a mistake, since it's already bounced back and forth before on the list, but with Dino support that we've gotten recently, it wouldn't really surprise me all that much if it came off the list a little bit. And Spellbook of Judgment I would have put going to 3, but given the card's history and how powerful it is, it might go to 2 first and then to 3 on the following list. As for the unlimited cards, I don't think there's anything else we really need to explain. Gazelle goes to 3 for Salamangreat with the new support, Engaged goes to 3 because Sky Strikers, despite their new support, need all the help that they can get. Orange Light and Desires haven't really done anything at 2, they can go to 3 just fine, and Ancient Fairy Dragon is a good card, but no one is going to be running more than 1 in their extra deck anyways. Anyways guys, that is all for my ban list prediction. In usual ban list prediction Yugi tubing fashion, feel free to roast my list in the comment section, or tell me what you guys agree or disagree with. Either way, make sure that you guys leave a thumbs up for me and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and you want to see more from Tombox and myself here. And until next time guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.